So you're going to need a Bible this morning. And if you can turn with me, hang on, let me things sorted out. Hang on. Okay. If you also turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 7. Now in the New International Version, that's page 442. And in the New Living Translations, that's 337. And it's always nice to know you're in tune, isn't it, when in our preparations. And Wendy and I did not collude, I promise you. It did make me laugh this morning when you said in 1 Chronicles chapter 7. And I thought, I've been there all week, so it's lovely. And it's, I don't know about you, but that picture in 1 Chronicles of the Shekinah glory coming down, I always think, have you ever been to York Minster? Anyone been to York Minster? And as you walk around the corner, you see it suddenly looms up in front of you. And I remember saying to Mary once when we were stationed there, wouldn't it be great, the Shekinah glory came down, you saw everyone on the pavement on their knees, it'd be a fantastic thing. Although that's not going to happen, I know. But just as we begin, I'd like to tell you a little story about King Cyrus, who was the founder of the Persian Empire. It was used of God to chase out the Babylonians, actually. But on defeating an enemy in one place, he took one of the captives, and it was a royal prince and his family. And he said to him, "What will you give me if I were to release if I were to release you?" He said, "I will give you half my wealth." And he said, "What about if I released your children?" He said, "I will give you everything that I possess." He said, what would you pay me if I were to just release your wife?" He said, "I will give you myself." And Cyrus was so moved by that devotion, he freed the whole family without price. And as they returned home, the prince looked at his wife and she said, "Wasn't Cyrus a handsome man?" And she said, with this great deal of love in her eyes, she said to him, "I didn't notice. I could only keep my eyes on the one who was willing to sacrifice his life for me." I thought it was just a beautiful picture of worship, of love, of adoration, of devotion. Now, worship and acts of worship, they have relevance in all societies around the world. And often a country's sociological makeup can actually find its root in its past religious ceremony and practice. Now, I do think it's really hard for us in our modern Western world, with all our baggage of our hedonist cultural mindset, to really appreciate just how important temples were in the ancient world. Now, for us as Baptists, for example, a church building is little more than a convenient place for us to meet. Now, it might hold some special memories for you. It might be a place where your family have always been. It might be the place you met Jesus. It might hold some very special memories, and I'm sure there's plenty in here this morning. And also, it offers a place where in our worship there's an ambience, there's an atmosphere as we join together, isn't there? That aids our worship of God so that we can hear him and know him better. But if something was to happen to our building, if a bolt of lightning struck it tomorrow and it fell to a heap of rubble, it wouldn't or shouldn't affect our faith at all, should it? We would just have to find an alternative arrangement and go to Ruth and Austin's garden. In the ancient world, life was very, very different. So here's a picture of anyone know what that place is? It's actually the back view of it. So this is the Pantheon. Yes, hands up if you've been to the Pantheon. It is an amazing place. As you go in and you look up, there's a hole down the top. And Pantheon, of course, talks about it's a temple to all gods. Temples as places of worship were so revered, so that, for example, in the Roman Empire, to desecrate a temple was a capital offense. And of course, if you were a Jew, then there was an even stronger reason for you to respect the temple, because that's the place where God dwells on planet Earth. All this for the Jew actually goes back to the Exodus from Egypt. The temple and their worship was a constant reminder of how God had rescued his people, and appeared to them before the tent of meeting as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And at the development of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, which was in fact a mobile temple, the presence of God would descend to indicate that God was present with his people. So for miles around, if they were laid out, and you're talking a couple of million people, okay, and they're all laid out in a military order, actually. If it's an amazing story, we've talked about this in our Bible study. And as they moved, it was a military operation, which actually goes back to Moses himself being a general. But for miles around, people could see these people on a plain, wherever it was, in the hills, and they would see the pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, knowing that their God was with them. In Exodus, let me read some Exodus for you. Exodus 40, it said, in all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of the Israelites during all their travels. Doesn't matter where they were, they could see the presence of God. They knew that he was there. And so as the people went to the temple to worship, they would remember their history lessons, they would remember the scriptures, and they would be reminded of how Moses would enter into the presence of God, and he would come out and his face would be shining with the Shekinah glory. It would be a reflection of the fact that he'd been in the presence of God. And then each year, at the Day of Atonement, the high priest would enter the tabernacle with the blood of a bull, which he would then sprinkle on top of the ark, which was the mercy seat. And then it was a sign then that God had forgiven the sins of his people. Now, as time went on, God had allowed his people to settle in the land where Solomon was to build the temple, which actually replaced the portable one. Now, in 2 Chronicles 7, we get an incredible view as to what it's like. We've already heard it once. We're going to hear it again. And I want you to keep your finger in that because we're going to come back there again. Let's look at 2 Chronicles 7:1, and we're just going to read a few verses. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices. And the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priests could not enter the temple of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled it. And when all the Israelites saw the fire coming down and the glory of the Lord above the temple, they knelt on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, he is good. His love endures forever. Now go down to verse 10. On the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people to their homes, joyful and glad in heart for the good things that the Lord had done for David and Solomon and for his people Israel. The people did not want to go. They were enjoying the presence of God. They knew the presence of God, and they were one together despite all their differences. This was the place they wanted to be. So after 3 weeks, Solomon sent them home. Go home. Now we see incidences of this right throughout the New Testament. I haven't got time to explore them, of people who just wanted to be with Jesus and he sent them home. The Gadarene demoniac, what happened to him? First missionary in the Bible. He wanted to stay with Jesus. He says, no, go home and tell everyone what the Lord has done for you. And he went to the Decapolis. That's the 10 cities. And so he became a missionary to that place as well. Clearly, this is God at work. The temple described here in John, this had actually been rebuilt and it had been beautified by King Herod. And it was the place of focus for worship. This is the place where God meets his people. Now, we talked about that a number of weeks ago. I don't know if you remember, we talked about the acreage of just how big the temple courts were. And the temple was inside the big building. And I don't know if you remember, but I showed you a picture of a big shopping centre in London, and actually it was as big as that. So there was a big space indoors, and the temple was right in the middle, and all the temple precincts were around that as well. These people wanted to be there. For the devout, there would be a great deal of comfort in all of these facts, all the history, and the presence because it gave them something they could see that helped them to relate to their faith. But it also meant that they could give something practical by way of maintenance. They could see it, they could be there, and they could do something. And here was the focus of worship, and it was the center of their community. But clearly, the temple was of great importance to them. But what we discover here in John chapter 2 is that all is not well with the temple. All is not well with Jewish worship. So what was needed was change. Let's look at John chapter 2. Keep your finger in 1 Chronicles 7 for a moment. John chapter 2, verse 13. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables, and to those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." So Jesus has gone for Passover, and when he gets there, he finds people selling cattle, sheep, doves, and others were exchanging money. Now, what we need to understand before we proceed any further is actually what's happening here. Actually, what is happening is not a bad thing. People came from all over the Roman Empire to worship at Jerusalem. But when they got there, they needed to have a sheep or a calf or at least a dove to make an offering to God. Now, it took long enough to get there in the first place without having to take along all your livestock with you. So people brought their money and then they bought the animals when they got there. Similarly, the law required only the purest silver could be used to pay the temple tax, which every male Jew had to do. So what you did, you took your money to the money changer who would give you some Tyrian silver, which was the purest that was known. And that's some of the Tyrian silver that's been found. One's a full, I don't know if it's a denarii, one's half a denarii, but I thought it gave you quite a good picture. This was the purest that was available. So these merchants were actually offering a service that was important to those who were devout in their worship to God. They were providing a service. There's no hint in the passage at all that they were acting unethically, though that might be the implication in later accounts. The trouble here was that they were in the wrong place. What should have been a place of prayer for all people had become a marketplace. You see, what had actually happened was that a market used to be across the Kidron Valley near the Mount of Olives. So when people arrived, they would have to go on across the valley. But economic rationalism has set in. Nothing seems to change, does it? Someone had realized that it's much more efficient to have their stalls right in the temple precincts. There's plenty of room. But the place they chose was the court of the Gentiles. That way, if someone got there and they needed to buy something or exchange money, they could easily do it without needing to go across the valley in the heat. And I suppose it's a bit, all this convenience stuff is a bit like the supermarket. When you get to the checkout and there's sweeties and magazines, there's always something on hand. Or you can go anywhere and find a cash machine now. Everyone's toting for business, but they make it as easy as possible. And of course, we're the convenience people, aren't we? And we talked about Amazon last week, you know. And my stuff did arrive on time, which is fantastic. The result of this in the temple area was that the worship of God had become subordinated to things that were there to support it. So that the market had become more important than the prayers of the faithful. And if you take note, it was a court of the Gentiles. It was so unfair for the non-Jewish people, those regarded as Gentiles, and they had to go and find alternative arrangements for worship now, so that devout Jews could actually go and get their doves and their calves or whatever they needed. And this is so current in the Christian church today. Too often, the peripheral things that seem so very important to us on a personal level, they actually intrude into worship. And this doesn't necessarily mean the things that we're physically doing. But it can be the thought patterns that we allow to dominate our minds and attitudes that lead to deceiving ourselves that we are more experienced spiritually than we actually are. We just kid ourselves time and time again. And I read a brilliant story this week of two high school teachers. And they were both going for an assistant head's job. And one guy had 20 years experience and the other guy had 8 years experience. And they were the only two candidates left. They were interviewed and the guy with 8 years experience got the job. Well, the guy with 20 years experience was incensed. Look at all this experience I've got. So he went and complained to the school board, and he said that look, I've got double of what he's got. Why would you turn me down? And they said, look, we've reviewed your application, and our conclusion is that you don't, in fact, have 20 years experience. You've got 1 year's experience that you've repeated 19 times. Here it is, you see. The relevance had gone. And the people were stuck in a form that had degenerated over the years, and they hadn't even noticed. And they thought that they were mature because they were continuing these patterns of worship. The mess that the temple was in, spiritually speaking, was an absolute scandal. Not only had the religious leaders and the people become lazy and remiss about their responsibilities to God in worship, but they were also bearing false testimony. What they were doing over and over again in worship was not gaining experience of God, not experiencing his presence, but simply repeating that which was convenient and comfortable. And there's another sermon in that. Historically, you see, over the years, the millennia, people, other nations had respected Israel. They had a healthy respect for the fact that their God was with them, that their worship was second to none. There was no other God that revealed himself in such a way, in a realistic way. In fact, if you're in any doubt, you just look at the Old Testament, you can see that Israel, when they were in obedience, they were untouchable. They prospered in everything they did. And that was to the cost of their enemies. The picture here in this text is different, living on memories of their heyday. The nation was just going through the motions of worship. And that's not to say that many were not devout. It was just that they'd never learned how to contextualize and apply their faith in a real and a meaningful way. And so the society and the nations around them they said, just become irrelevant to them. Because now Israel's God was just as arbitrary as every other God that was around. Let's go back to 2 Chronicles. Chapter 7, verse 19. But if you turn away and forsake the decrees and commands that I've given you and go off and serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot Israel from my land which I've given them, and I will reject this temple I've consecrated for my name. I will make it a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. And this temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass by will be appalled, and they will say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? People will answer, because they've forsaken the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who brought them out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshipping and serving them. That is why he brought disaster on them. Even those who don't believe will know. These folk needed to learn, just as the Christian church needs to learn desperately, that adapting worship styles and communication of the truth to fit present culture does not mean that we change the tenets of our faith. It means that we must re-examine just what we believe, keep the truth, and cut away all those extras of tradition, to cut away the nonsense of theological bias and prejudice. Jesus saw all of this. And so what did he do? He cleared the temple. He took cords, rope, whatever it was, made a whip, and he started chasing all the animals out. Now remember what I said to you about the temple precincts, like a big super place, one of these shopping malls. The temple's in the middle. These precincts are outside. People going about their business from all over their empire at that time. And suddenly there's cows and sheep running through everything. It was pandemonium. And then he knocks over the tables of the money changers. And he says, how dare you turn my father's house into a marketplace? You see, his anger is born out of disappointment and frustration. But also, there is grace in here as well. And that's kind of a strange thing to say. But this isn't just some kind of outburst of righteous indignation. Jesus is scolding them, but at the same time, he's demonstrating what needs to be done. Their behavior deserved judgment, but he gives them a graphic demonstration of the sort of clearing out needed in the temple and in their own lives. And sometimes that clear out needs to be ruthless. So what is it in your life that needs to go? What is it that prevents your full commitment to Jesus as Lord of your life? What is it that holds you in this pretense that you are the only one who knows how you can live and worship your way? I've already said that there was nothing wrong with having this market. It's just in the wrong place. It's just that in trying to keep up the form of worship, the intent has been lost. And that can happen so easily, can't it? We can be so concerned about the form that we lose sight of the real reason that we meet. We are here to worship God. What is man's chief end? To glorify God and enjoy him forever. Why is it there's so many miserable Christians around? I know so many Christians that are just not enjoying God forever. They're not at all. They don't even know him. Because they've just reverted back from the moment they've trusted him and they've experienced the Spirit in their lives. They've actually stood back and said, right, now I've got that sorted. Now I can get on with my life. You know, the Corinthian church is a really good example. They were really keen to worship God. Really keen to just get it right. But their practice just ended up breaking the church apart. So much so that the Apostle Paul spends most of his first letter to them correcting their mistakes. And let me digress just for a moment. This letter to the Corinthians is full of Paul addressing their concerns. And he starts with a sort of yes, but approach. Yes, you got this right, but you've got that wrong. And when he comes to discuss the way that they celebrate the Lord's Supper or communion, he says, in the following directives, I have no praise for you, for your meetings do more harm than good. You see, the result of their concentration on getting the outward things right was not true worship of God at all. Rather, it was the destruction of their worship. They were not enjoying God forever because the focus on their image was all-consuming. We've got to practice not trying to look like Christians, but we've got to practice being Christians. Now, John here speaks a lot in his gospel, and we will cover some more of this, on worshipping God. And when he's speaking, for example, to the woman at the well in John 4, he tells the woman that worship of God is not in some geographical site, but it's in spirit and in truth. Worship in truth is bound up with Jesus, who is the truth. Now, we're told later in the gospel that he is the true vine, he is the true shepherd, he is the way, the truth, and the life. So to worship in spirit and in truth is to worship with Jesus at the center of our worship. The only way to ensure that our worship is not consumed by the outward forms rather than the inward intent is to ensure that Jesus remains our focus. Not in the ways that we worship or the aids of worship that we employ. See, change is needed. And we need to realize that the new temple is here. You know, it seems a bit ironic to me that those who were concerned to get their worship right thought they were showing zeal for God's house by actually going through the motions every day. It's a bit like Christians coming to church on Sunday. I must be really zealous because I go to church every Sunday. Because I know the hymns. Because I hear the word. Because we spend time in prayer. But in fact, they've missed the point. It was Jesus whose zeal pointed them in the right direction. And if you want irony, here's another bit of an irony. The disciples, this bunch of fishermen, who were rarely at synagogue probably, they were the ones who remembered their Old Testament scriptures. Psalm 69, verse 9. Zeal for your house will consume me. In the end, it's Jesus' zeal for the house of God that ends up in his crucifixion. The only response that those in control could make, if you look at verse 18, John 2, what sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? Now, that's really quite an interesting response from them, because there were laws to deal with someone who came in and upset the temple. So if Jesus was just a troublemaker, they could have easily dealt with him. But what's interesting at this point in his life is they see him acting like a prophet. And so they're asking him, what is the sign of your prophetic authority? What is sad here is that they examine him without any sense of self-examination. It wouldn't have taken much, would it, to see that what he'd done was in fact a prophetic act that was carried out in his own authority. The truth of what he said should have been self-evident, and if what he did was truly prophetic act, then it was done on the authority that came from God the Father. But they didn't see that. Their response is a defense mechanism. Why do we use that? Well, here, that's the reason. They didn't want to be under authority. They wanted to be in authority. And isn't that true of every single one of us? Where is that authority in our lives? Is it us? Is it our decision making, our priorities, or is it the Lord's decision? You know, someone said to me the other day that we were watching a film at our house group the other day. It just occurs to me. And it was great. We watched a film called Faith Like Potatoes. I don't know if you've seen it. We could lend you the film if you like. It's fantastic. Only £2.38 on eBay, so there you go. So everyone could buy one of them. And it was great. And a comment was made, actually, and it was a good comment. We need to be raised up like that. We need to hear God. But what struck me in the film was this man, the reason God raised him up was because he listened to what God was saying, and he knew the voice of God. And because he knew the voice of God, he knew how to act. When we're under our own authority, we don't hear the voice of God. We know what his voice is going to be saying, certainly from the scriptures, but we decided to do it in our way. He has to be first in absolutely everything. They want to test him rather than take notice of what he is saying and doing. And of course, they're not much different from the crowds that we encounter later on at the end of the passage who believe in Jesus because of the signs he's doing. And there's a danger of looking for signs to prove the trustworthiness of God. Something else occurred to me, and it's another digression, but it fits. Have you ever thought about the time when Jesus is being crucified, and those who shout to him, "Show us the Son of God by coming down from the cross"? Do you remember that? What if he had come down? Well, apart from a failure to complete his work on earth, what sort of faith would that engender? Oh, it would have impressed people for a short time. But it wouldn't have been long before they were demanding another sign, and another sign, and another sign. And Jesus would be a bit like a genie in a bottle, incredibly powerful, but at the beck and call of those who claim to be his followers. It doesn't work like that. We are not in a position to make any demands at all. We are his servants. He is not our servant. And what about us? Have we ever tried to make a deal with God? You know, a sort of thing. Maybe ask God to give you some sign that I should do a certain thing and I'll do it. Well, of course, we spiritualize it. We're really good at that, aren't we? We call it laying a fleece. And we talked about this in Judges 6, and no, that's completely out of context. Or we tell God that if he does this, then we'll believe him and do that. Whether we like it or not, these kinds of demands are nothing more than an attempt to domesticate God, to control him. And that's exactly what these Jewish leaders are trying to do here. And it's what the crowd would like to do. Because no one wants to be led. They want someone to blame. Well, Jesus does offer them a sign. But the sign he offers is more than just a miracle. It is a prophecy of the end of the earthly temple. It's a demonstration of the true temple of God that was to come. And it's an overwhelming sign of the authority that he is God incarnate. The temple is finished because Jesus has replaced it with the perfect temple. New International Version, page 1208. New Living Translation, 925. Hebrews chapter 10. Let's have a look at that together. And verse 19. How are we doing? Okay. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way open for us through the curtain that is his body, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope that we profess, for he who promised is faithful. As we finish, let me just qualify this. In John chapter 1 and verse 14, we see the word became flesh and lived among us, or dwelt among us. But what we've lost in our English translation is that the word used here is a very unusual one. The word is tabernacled. So as soon as we see that expression of the word dwelling or living or tabernacling with us, as soon as we see that, we are meant to think of the original tabernacle in which God came down to meet with his people. Jesus comes as the perfect tabernacle. He comes as the perfect temple in whom we are unable to meet God personally, and so we can participate in the divine nature. All of those Old Testament images of the temple as a meeting place between God and his people, as a place where sins are forgiven, and as the place where the Messiah will appear, all of them find their fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Our worship of him must be pure and focused, and nothing, not even the most reasonable thing, should be allowed to intrude on that. Why? Well, because change is needed. And the new temple is here. We've got to simply believe. And we'll continue next time. Thank you. Let's just pray, shall we? We thank you, our Father, for these dramatic moments that we read of in the Scriptures. We recognize the confusion of some as they protect themselves and they protect their history. But we thank you for that truth that cuts straight through all of that and shows people in a real demonstration that a clear out needs to be done. You've let so many things get in the way. And we will confess this morning, we're just the same. We allow our life to get on top of us and things to get in the way. And so you become the second priority, not the first. So this morning we pray that you would challenge us again and move us by your Spirit to trust you with all of our heart, so that we will know your voice, we would hear your voice, we'll be able to react to your commands, and that we would know your blessing. In Jesus' lovely name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Mindy.